The fire was built slowly, not for heat, not for light. It was meant to linger, to stain the walls with the scent of burning silk and fear. No records say who lit it, but someone did. And they did it while the musicians still played. The priest whispered, "Forgive me," but not to God, to her. He bowed before he spoke. His robe trembled, not from guilt, from calculation, because forgiveness wasn't granted that day. It was sold. Birds vanished from the sky above Paris. They did not return for 3 days. Some say they were frightened by the drums. Others say they knew. She wore black, not out of mourning, but mastery. Her veil was lace, but it moved like smoke. They say her breath smelled of rosewater and arsenic. A bride was dressed that morning, and by nightfall, her brothers were flayed alive behind the banquet hall, screams stitched into the wedding march. No one left early. That would be remembered. History called it vengeance, but vengeance is personal. This was public, and the woman who ordered it didn't blink once. She watched. She waited. She smiled. And the fire was still burning when the guests began to dance. Catherine de' Medici was not born into darkness. She was carved into it. A girl once orphaned by war, groomed in foreign courts, raised beneath the Vatican's shadow. When she arrived in France, they called her the banker's daughter, Italian, papist, a womb in disguise. Even her wedding was drenched in suspicion. The crowd whispered about her dowry more than her vows. She smiled through it, quiet as snowfall, watching them count coins instead of character. But that smile was a blade folded inward. And over time, it began to cut back. She was not queen by love. She was queen by vacancy. Her husband preferred another woman. Her court preferred another bloodline. She built her power like a spider spins silk unnoticed until it strangles. Her beauty faded, but her silence sharpened. And when her husband died, they said France would collapse. But France did not collapse. France bent. Years passed. Her sons wore crowns too large for their skulls. She held them upright with invisible strings. When Protestants and Catholics hunted each other in the streets, Catherine didn't preach peace. She arranged marriages, paper alliances, smiles inked with betrayal, and behind every union, a blade. The wedding of her daughter was supposed to be peace. Instead, it became a purge. Her enemies walked in wearing velvet and left without their skin. Some say she planned it. Others say she simply allowed it. But Catherine never confessed, never explained. She played the widow, the mother, the regent, each role with precision. No saints whispered to her. No angels defended her. And yet, she survived every coup, because she understood what queens are never taught. Mercy is not the opposite of cruelty. It is its most elegant disguise. The wedding was arranged under the pretense of unity. A Catholic princess, Margaret of Valois, wedded to a Protestant prince, Henry of Navarre. The ink on the invitations was still wet when the whispers began, not of celebration, but calculation. They came from every corner of France, nobles, bishops, mercenaries, all cloaked in the velvet of civility. The Louvre became a nest of painted masks and hollow laughter. Outside, the city choked on tension, windows shuttered, horses refused to move near the palace. Somewhere, a merchant dropped a glass jar, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. Inside, Catherine moved like smoke, unseen, but present. Her fingers slid across tapestries embroidered with fleur-de-lis, eyes scanning every detail. She ordered more guards. She summoned astrologers. She lit more candles than needed, as though trying to outshine what was already in motion. Beneath the linens of her chambers, letters were hidden, some written in lemon juice, others carved faintly into prayer books. Messages to men with no titles, orders masked as blessings. The groom smiled uneasily. Henry of Navarre, young and too clever to believe in peace, watched the Queen Mother from across the hall. He kissed her hand, and she returned the gesture with a look that neither welcomed nor warned. Just a glance, cold and surgical. Margaret stood beside him, a bouquet of white lilies trembling slightly in her grip. She had not slept. Her prayers were recited in silence, lips moving but voice withheld. Even she knew this was not a wedding. It was an arrangement of bodies in space. 2 nights after the vows were exchanged, the assassins moved. They were not dressed as soldiers, but as servants. They did not knock. They entered under the pretense of delivering wine. The Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the Protestant leaders, was shot in the street days earlier but had not died. Catherine had visited him. She said nothing, only touched his bandaged hand and left. Then came the signal, a bell that should not have rung. At a time, no bells were scheduled. Midnight, August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day. The massacre began with the admirals, but it did not stop with them. Doors were kicked in, curtains torn, women raped in front of their children, children thrown from balconies, priests given knives, husbands forced to watch, blood pooled in the streets, mixing with the remnants of wedding wine, bodies hung from lampposts not for punishment, but for punctuation. Catherine did not order every strike. She did not need to. She had built the conditions, planted the triggers, and removed the brakes. Her silence was the orchestration. Her absence was a signature. The king, her son Charles IX, reportedly shouted at her, trembling, overwhelmed by the scale of the killings. "Kill them all," he had said. "They claim," but not with authority, with fear. She calmed him, as she had since he was a child, by placing her hand on his heart. "France must remain whole," she whispered. But France did not remain whole. France was flayed, city by city. The massacre bled into the countryside, into the provinces, and into the history books that would never print her name beside it. Those who survived did so by wearing the wrong cross in the right moment. Neighbors turned executioners. Families dissolved under suspicion. It was not war. It was ritual, cleansing through cruelty. Witnesses said Catherine returned to the wedding banquet the next evening. The hall had been scrubbed, bodies removed, blood disguised with crushed berries. She walked among the remaining guests, nodding softly, a dark silk collar framing her face like a funeral portrait come to life. Her voice was never raised. She told jokes. She asked about dowries. She complimented a necklace, even as its owner's sister was being dismembered in the stables. The musicians played softer this time. No drums, just strings. Not every Protestant was killed. Some were kept, for leverage, for theater. Henry of Navarre, the groom, was spared not out of mercy, but necessity. He was forced to convert, forced to kneel, forced to sign oaths he would later break. Catherine watched him do it. Not out of delight, but discipline. Because power was not in the act of killing, it was in who begged and who did not. She had learned this from the Medici court, where poison was poured like perfume and secrets aged like wine. Catherine brought it all with her, the apothecaries, the astrologers, the poisons hidden inside books and rings. But her true weapon was patience. And during those wedding days, she wielded it like a guillotine turned inward. The city did not explode. It decayed. After the massacre, the silence grew louder. The bells stopped ringing. Birds did not return. Merchants closed their shutters even when no one passed. Children were born during those days and never learned who their parents truly were. They only knew the smell of smoke, dried blood, and bridal roses trampled under cavalry boots. Paris reeked of it. History tried to clean the memory, calling it political, necessary, tragic. But the truth had no need for such language. It simply stared back, through the faces of those left alive. Catherine aged but did not weaken. Her skin grew more translucent, like old parchment. Her dresses became heavier, her jewels darker. She spent more time in silence, her eyes fixed on unseen things. Her confessor asked her once, near the end, if she regretted anything. She did not answer. She only lifted a mirror to her face and looked, not into her own eyes, but behind them, as if searching for something that had long since taken root. She saw her sons die one by one. Charles, who screamed in dreams and drowned in sweat. Henry, who dressed in lace and wielded knives with too much joy. Francis, who ruled for months and passed like a shadow, each one touched by the blood she had loosed, each one falling, not from battle wounds, but from a curse they never recognized. By the end of her reign, France was splintered. The wars of religion raged on. More weddings were proposed, more treaties signed with trembling hands. But every time a guest entered a palace, they checked the ceilings, listened for bells that shouldn't ring, watched the Queen's hands, searching for the signal. And Catherine, she had already vanished behind the ritual. Her legacy was not written in treaties, but in the way doors stayed locked long after she died, the way fires were built with extra distance from the walls, the way guests looked twice at every glass of wine. She was not loved, she was not forgiven, but she was remembered, because cruelty, when done slowly, becomes tradition, and Catherine de' Medici, she understood that better than any monarch alive. It did not happen in the shadows. It was not a secret act, not the kind of murder whispered about and buried in rumors. No, the death Catherine prepared was a spectacle not for justice, but for obedience. The wedding that had once masked a massacre was now the blueprint for something far more intimate. No city burned, no army marched. Only one life was taken, and yet that life was arranged like a liturgy. The guest list was chosen, the instruments selected, the room scented with sage and iron. It was not enough to kill. She needed to cleanse, not herself, France. The victim was a Huguenot noble, young, idealistic. He had spoken too freely after the massacre, not in defiance, but in disbelief. He believed peace was still possible. Catherine believed otherwise. He was arrested under false charges, conspiracy, blasphemy, treason, the usual tools. But no trial followed, just a procession, through narrow halls, past tapestries woven with saints and beasts, through chambers lined with cold mirrors that reflected the eyes of everyone who watched and said nothing. He was not bound in chains. That would have ruined the effect. He walked upright, confused, uncertain if this was punishment or performance. Catherine was already seated when he entered. She wore black, but not in mourning in majesty. A widow's veil, rings of jet and obsidian, her face powdered like marble, her eyes hollowed from years of smoke and whispers. She did not rise, she did not speak. She nodded once, and the guards understood. The young man opened his mouth to ask a question. None came, only the echo of his breath, swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. They stripped him slowly, not violently, with precision, like unwrapping a gift, his robes first, then his shirt, then his skin. They began at the shoulders, slicing thin lines, peeling back the flesh like parchment. He screamed once, then tried to bite his tongue. They did not gag him. They wanted the sound. The priest nearby did not hold a cross. He held a quill, writing each movement, recording not for God, but for the Queen's archive. The smell came next. Burnt copper. Sweat turned sour. The scent of someone losing their name. The skin around his ribs clung tighter, trying to retreat. Blood pooled but was caught in shallow bowls, none allowed to stain the floor. This was not a killing. This was a rite. The executioner was not a brute, but a surgeon, trained in anatomy and silence. His face remained still. His hands moved like a painter working by candlelight. Catherine did not flinch. She watched the body unravel, watched the boy become a symbol. She did not blink when his voice cracked. She only raised one finger and the tempo changed. They cut faster, now down the back, now across the arms. A pattern emerged. Spirals, circles, marks meant to speak to something deeper than pain. Some say it was alchemical, others say it was Medici. He did not beg. Not because he was brave, but because he was past begging. By the time they reached his thighs, he no longer seemed to be a person. Just breath, just twitch, just flesh without intention. The audience, yes, there was one nobles, cardinals, poets all watched without speaking. Some turned pale, some clenched their gloves. One man fainted. He was removed silently, so the ritual would not be interrupted. Catherine rose only once. When the skin at the chest was peeled back fully, revealing the soft, twitching heart still beating, she stepped forward. Her hand hovered inches above it. She did not touch, just watched, as if waiting to see whether it would stop on its own. It didn't. It fought, until the surgeon's knife slid between the ribs, gentle as a lullaby. The heart stuttered, shivered, then gave up. No applause, no declaration, just the sound of silk brushing stone as she turned and left the room. The doors closed behind her like tombstones being placed upright. The body was never buried. It was burned. The ashes mixed with cedar and incense and scattered into the Seine. The river, it was said, ran darker for days, but no one mentioned it. No proclamations followed, no accusations. The nobles went home. The poets wrote of allegories. The priests said it was justice, and Catherine, she lit a candle that night, not for the dead, but to remember the silence. Word spread not by messengers, but by changes. People bowed lower, spoke softer, dared less. Protestant leaders who once roared now whispered. Catholic lords who once questioned her now prayed before entering her court. Even the king, her own son, began to sleep with a dagger under his pillow. He never asked who the boy was. He never asked why it happened. He only kissed her hand more often and did not look her in the eye. What had died that day was not just a man, it was resistance. Catherine understood this. Pain passed. Symbols remained. A body flayed at a wedding meant something. It meant the queen had rewritten the ceremony. Unity through elimination. Celebration through obedience. That was her gospel. The room was never used again. It was sealed. The tapestries burned. The bowls scrubbed with vinegar and prayers. But some say, on certain nights, when the wind bends toward the palace, you can still hear something, not a scream, but a rustling, like flesh remembering it was once worn. Catherine never repeated the ritual. She didn't have to. Once was enough. Once is always enough if the audience never forgets. And they didn't. Her enemies began to vanish, not by blade, but by disappearance. A letter never answered, a carriage never arriving, a child never born. Her poisons were quiet, her punishments rare, but her presence always near. And so France learned, not through decrees, not through reforms, but through memory, through the smell of burnt skin at a feast, through the echo of a bell that was never supposed to ring, through the image of a queen who watched a man die with the same calm as watching flowers wilt. This was not death. This was doctrine, and it bled into the heart of a nation that never truly healed. When Catherine de' Medici finally stepped away from the center of power, she left no proclamations, no monuments, no farewell. She didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't etched in marble, it was sewn into silence. France didn't mourn her departure. It absorbed it like a wound that never scabs. only deepens. The corridors she once haunted grew darker, not because she was gone, but because her absence reminded them of how closely death had once walked beside them. Those who had survived her reign, nobles, priests, courtiers, carried invisible marks, not from blades, but from knowing that under her watch, history had been rewritten with flesh, and peace had been stitched from terror. The church did not condemn her. It never mentioned her by name, so it couldn't, because to name her would be to acknowledge complicity. The Pope had once blessed her son's rule. The bishops had toasted her weddings. The cardinals had dined beneath frescoes painted in her honor. Now, they looked away. Official records grew thin. Diaries were redacted. Letters burned. The chronicles of that era became less about truth and more about forgetting. But forgetting does not erase. It stains. And Catherine's stain was not one that faded. It bled through generations. There were rumors her soul never left the Louvre. Servants refused to enter certain rooms at night. They spoke of a perfume lingering in places no one had walked for hours, bitter and sweet. A scent like dried roses steeped in vinegar. They said her chair rocked by itself. Her mirror refused to reflect. Her old gowns, stored in trunks beneath the floor, seemed to rustle as if breathing. But these were stories. Stories told by those who knew better than to speak plainly. The royal family fared no better. Her sons, all three, wore the crown, but none held it long. Francis II died first, a child overwhelmed by courtly weight. Then Charles IX, the boy who had watched the massacre unfold and had screamed for it to stop even as he ordered it forward, choked to death in his own blood. His lungs rotted from within, as if every breath he drew carried the ghosts of St. Bartholomew's day. His screams were said to echo through the walls even after his body was sealed away. Henry III, her last son, ruled with silk and steel, veils and daggers. He adored his mother, feared her, mimicked her, but he lacked her patience. He walked corridors perfumed and paranoid, whispering to shadows that did not answer. He wore jewels like armor, but armor could not protect him from legacy. He died with a dagger in his heart, stabbed by a friar, a man who claimed to bring the word of God, but instead brought the end of a dynasty. Catherine's line was extinguished not with fire, but with silence. A house once filled with children and tapestries now echoed with wind and footsteps that did not belong to the living. And yet, even in death, Catherine remained present. Her enemies, those who had survived her punishments, those who had once whispered her name with venom, began to fall, not by violence, by time, by ruin. Their children inherited titles stripped of meaning. Their estates were seized under new laws, their legacies reduced to footnotes. The church canonized none of them, but it remembered Catherine's children, and while it never forgave them, it never denied them either, because power, once tasted, lingers like rot in the roots of a tree. The trunk may fall, but the soil never forgets. In the years that followed, the massacre became myth. Some said it was exaggerated. Others claimed it never happened. Paintings were commissioned that showed Catherine praying at altars, lighting candles, grieving her sons. Portraits softened her features, narrowed her eyes, painted her lips with compassion. But behind every stroke of the brush was the memory of screams in the streets, blood in the wine cellars, and a bride in white stained red before the night ended. No historian could erase that. No priest could cleanse it. She became a ghost in literature. The Dark Queen, the poisoner, the schemer. Men wrote of her as if she were a warning, a spell, a storm wrapped in satin. But they did not write of the women she flayed, the children she orphaned, the silence she weaponized. Because to do so would be to confront what royalty truly means: not grace, but survival. Not God, but control. Her surviving grandchildren tried to cleanse the blood with progress. They built churches, minted coins, changed their names. One even tried to have her body moved, reburied beneath a chapel with stained glass that showed angels instead of executions. But the earth refused. The priests said the ground had shifted. The masons said the stones cracked. The truth, though never spoken, was that Catherine's body could not be moved. Because some legacies do not relocate. They root in Rouen, where many of her orders had first taken shape. The streets grew narrower with time. People avoided the alley behind the old courthouse, the one where a candle still flickered, though no one had lit it in years. On certain nights, when the wind came from the east, it was said you could hear fabric tearing, not from weather, from memory. And at weddings, French nobles began to avoid white altogether, not out of fashion, out of fear, because white had once been worn on a day when the rivers turned red. Poets would not write elegies for her. They wrote warnings. Beware the widow in black, one line read, for she buries nations between sips of wine. Another wrote, she smiled, and the stars hid their faces. These were not metaphors. They were attempts desperate, trembling attempts to give shape to something that still stalked their sleep. Centuries later, France would canonize her enemies, not by name, but by cause. The Protestants she killed became martyrs. The cities she silenced became birthplaces of revolution. The very blood she spilled became fuel for the fires that would one day burn the monarchy to ash. And still, Catherine's name was never burned. It was whispered, because fire consumes, but whispers infect. Even now, her image lingers not in museums, but in instincts. A queen smiles too long, and someone remembers. A candle blows out without wind, and someone recalls. A bride hesitates at the altar, and someone wonders what price was paid for this peace. Her enemies died, their names forgotten. But Catherine de' Medici, her name remains carved in the mouth of every historian who dares to speak the truth softly, because she did not flay her enemies only in life. She flayed them in memory, and that kind of death is never undone. They say the fire died long ago, that the blood has been scrubbed from the stones, that Catherine de' Medici is just a chapter in history, her cruelty buried beneath centuries of dust and denial. But Rouen still breathes her silence. The corridors she walked remain colder than the rest of the palace. The chapel bells avoid the hour she once chose for executions. And the mirrors in her private chamber are said to reflect what isn't there. Brides still walk the aisle with trembling hands, not from love, but from some echo they cannot name. Priests still bless the wine twice. Guests still check the windows before they sleep. The palace has changed hands, changed faces, changed flags, but it has never forgotten. Power like hers does not die. It waits, it listens, it learns. And sometimes, in the hush between celebration and catastrophe, you can feel it, the lace-shrouded breath of a woman who never blinked. Even as her enemies begged, she died praying. They wrote, but no one says what she prayed for. No one dares ask. Because some prayers are not meant to reach heaven. Some are meant to echo forever in stone.